to this special webinar event, How to Make Your Property a Standout for Tenants. I'm Terry Ryder, Managing Director of hotspotting.com.au. My special guest presenter today is Mark Shorrock from Bluestone Property Management. We recently did an investor survey, and we found that the number one factor occupying the minds of investors around Australia was attracting better tenants and achieving better rentals. So the question is, how do you achieve that in a competitive market? So here today to discuss that topic is Mark Shorrock. We'll be speaking about the basic improvements you can make to a property to make all the difference, to stand out from the crowd. So Mark, welcome.
Thank you, Terry. Thanks for having me once again. Always a pleasure to be on one of your webinars. And yes, it is a good topic to talk about. It really forms the cornerstone of the investment process for most investors. And if we talk about making a property tenable, and that involves many sort of aspects in rent, cleaning, condition, presentation, maintenance, and then also the marketing and availability of people to show prospective tenants through. So all of those things need to culminate together in the perfect storm, so to speak, to maximise yield for investors.
Yeah, in our promotions for this event, we talked about the reasons why this should be occupying the minds of investor owners. Issues such as if your property is presented, it's more tenantable, reduces vacancy periods, helps you get a better tenant, helps you achieve a higher rent, but also makes it more likely that a tenant will stay in place. And of course, that's one of the paramount concerns, isn't it, for investor owners, that if you've got a good tenant, you want to keep them long term if you can.
It is. It's a common misconception. While driving the rent up does help for valuation purposes, in that you can get a higher valuation potentially with and create more equity in the property. But the reality of the matter is, you need to create yield and cash flow to pay off a mortgage. And to do that, you need a tenant in the property. Without the tenant being in the property paying the rent, you don't have that. Also, that the higher the rent, the higher the yield is another common misconception. We, having been a second generation agent and having done this for 21 years, I know for a fact that a lower yield, higher occupancy strategy is far better than a low rent, high occupancy strategy yields more rent than a high rent, low occupancy strategy.
So in other words, if you might have a slightly lower rent than you might want to achieve, but if that means that you've got a tenant in place 52 weeks of the year, you're actually getting a better return than if you've got a higher rent, but you've got a vacancy period.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because in most cases, I know definitely in South East Queensland, we charge a letting fee. Industry standard is 1 week's rent at $500 a week or $520 a week. If you converted that, that's $10 a week on the rent at $520. So we had a scenario this morning to put this into perspective and context. Currently tenanted property at $520 a week. It is a unit in Toowong, to name the suburb, a couple of kilometres in the sort of, I would say, you would say the middle ring. Tenants were thinking about moving out. The owner wanted to put the rent up from $520 a week. The tenant said if the rent increased, they would move out. We managed to renegotiate the rent at the current price of $520. We provided 3 comparable rentals to the owner. Now, the property, if it became vacant, would probably only rent in the current market for $480. Now, on that scenario, at $480, 27 days is the average days on market, plus the letting fee equal to 1 week's rent. I think off the top of my head, the rent was about $22,000 there. Times 52 at $520 is $27,000. There's $3,000 difference in the yield on that one example, and that happened this morning. So that's how that works. And to put it into context of the webinar, these properties need to be clean and well presented and available for tenants to inspect, for them for the investors listening to maximise their yields.
Yeah. So it's a good illustration of the basic point that although it might be the natural impulse of an investor owner as a landlord wanting to get us higher rent, it can be counterproductive, and sometimes it may be a smarter strategy to keep your rent where it is, and you actually end up with a better overall outcome across 12 months than if you're trying to sort of maximise the rent as your prime motivation.
Yeah, and look, it's not uncommon for people to think that. The reason you're asking a question and we're talking about it is natural for people to think, get the highest rent. But I know for a fact, with being a second generation agent with a 21 years experience, I've seen tenants who rent properties for at or slightly below market value. They generally appreciate that they're on a good wicket. And we've talked about this before on other subjects, Terry, that they care for the property, maintain it as if it's their own. Even if it's as small as replacing a tap washer or a light bulb, doing some minor maintenance themselves. Now, to give another example, to put this back into context, if your tenant did 4 to 5 small handyman jobs around the property in a year, saved you the call-out fee of around about $100, $125, that's going to save you as an investor about $500 a year, equivalent to $10 a week on the rent. Now, that tenant typically stays in the property for 3 to 4 years as opposed to 6 to 12 months. With that, you get the benefit of 100% occupancy over that time frame. And the most of the wear and tear caused on a property is through naturally undesirable tenants. So you eliminate that happening. And also the next highest point of excessive fair wear and tear is tenants moving in and out of properties. Now, moving heavy items, refrigerators, beds, different things like that, kitchen tables, gym equipment, that all is the biggest contributor to excessive damage, and gouging walls, gouging carpet, gouging lino, cracking tiles, all of those types of things.
That's actually a very interesting point, Mark, one that I would never have thought of in terms of wear and tear on a property, that if you're constantly changing tenants, the actual process of people moving out and new people moving in is actually a big factor in the wear and tear factor. So just another reason why it's a good idea to do whatever you can to keep a good tenant in place, and that might mean some small compromise on rental.
Yep, absolutely. And yeah, you've got the lease renewal fee, the vacancy period, the excessive wear and tear. So you combine all of those factors, it's definitely worthwhile, even if it meant as far as compromising on a minor dispute over who would be responsible. A good example is light bulbs in Queensland. The legislation doesn't clearly define the responsibility, and it is more so the tenant's responsibility to replace a light bulb, but not a specialised light bulb. For instance, something in an oven or a range hood, or a hard-to-reach place like above a stairwell. And rather than fighting about it and getting your tenant offside, it might be worthwhile. What we typically do is get the owner to approve in writing us to send an electrician out. They'll repair that item, plus check all the other electrical items in the property and do preventative maintenance while they're there. Makes that $100, $150 call-out fee economical for both parties.
Okay. So let's just have a bit of a discussion about rentals and where they're at the moment. There's all sorts of misconceptions around the nation about what might be happening with rents because of mainly because of media coverage, mainstream media, focusing perhaps on high vacancies in the CBD areas of the biggest cities, but that's not really a typical conditions in other parts of Australia. You're currently sitting in Brisbane, Mark. What are you finding in terms of where rents are at the moment?
Yeah, really good question, Terry. And I've just been popping through the slides here. Look, I'm not a professional at creating these PowerPoint slides, but I've been sort of scrolling through them as we've been talking, and some of this talks about that, and we can distribute these at the end. I'm finding we've got two markets, distinct markets in Brisbane, or the greater Brisbane area, and that being the inner city apartment market and inner middle ring apartment market, a unit market, and then the housing market, townhouses, houses outside of that. Now, there is some oversupply still in the inner city, inner middle ring apartment unit market, primarily come from two or three contributing factors. One being Brisbane did have a little bit of an oversupply. Pre-COVID, the increased, the decreased vacancy rate plus increased yield confirmed that the market had absorbed the majority of the oversupply. So that was very, very good. However, what happened was when COVID came along, hotels, Airbnb, short-term accommodation rentals, a lot of those converted to what we call, permanent or fixed-term tenancies. And that diluted that market significantly and has meant that it's made it very, very hard for anyone with an apartment in the inner city, inner middle ring to rent it out. Extended days on market, 5, 10, 15, 20% decrease in rent. We're seeing the polar opposite on the sort of middle or outer ring housing townhouse market, in that while we aren't seeing significant rental increases, now we are seeing some increases where properties were rented pre-COVID under market value, as tends to happen. To give you an example, the tenant that you've had in the property, as per our previous discussion that we had just a couple of minutes ago, has been in there for 5 years at maybe the rent's been increasing $10 per year and the rent is $450 instead of $500. So it's under market value, around about 10%. That tenant moves out, then you can do an adjustment on the rent, probably re-advertise it for $500. If the current rent is $500 and the tenant moves out, we're generally advising that, while there aren't any increases, the benefit is that there also aren't any decreases in the rent. We would re-advertise the property at $500 a week. Maybe there might be an opportunity to test the market whilst the current tenant is in the property at $510 or $520 a week. We would start sort of 3 to 4 weeks out or 2 to 3 weeks out before the current tenant moves out. And we have a strategy in place where we recommend to our investors, and you could adopt this if you're listening today, where let's say at 4 weeks out, you might have the rent at $520 for the first week or two. And if you haven't got any sort of good activity on the property, and by activity I mean inquiry and inspections and hope applications, you would make an adjustment on that rent from $520 down to $510, and the closer you got to the property becoming vacant, you would come back to that previous rental amount of $500 when the tenant moved out, and hopefully you don't need to reduce it from there.
Okay, so just to give people some statistics about what rents are doing different parts of the country. The latest information out this week from SQM Research, which publishes weekly bulletins on what's happening with prices and rents in the major cities. There's actually, rents have been actually performing quite strongly in different parts of the country over the last 12 months. The exceptions again are Sydney and Melbourne. Both in the last month and in annual terms, rents have fallen in the two biggest cities, but as I've said earlier and have said many times in the recent past, they are the exception to the rule. The rule is in fact rents very, very solid over the last 12 months and also in the most recent month. Brisbane, they're nudging up very slightly according to these figures. Perth is doing very, very well. Adelaide is also doing very well, getting a good rental growth. Canberra, Hobart, these are all places where vacancies overall are below 1%. So there is obviously a correlation between what's happening with vacancy rates and what's happening with rentals. So it shouldn't surprise that those cities where vacancies are very, very low, we are seeing rents in those particular locations increasing, both in the last month and also in annual terms. And Brisbane is perhaps vacancies a little bit higher, but certainly well below 3% overall. So the market is tending more towards undersupply than oversupply. And Brisbane rents are very solid as well, which is again showing just how well real estate as an asset class is performing in this pandemic and the technical recession that we have as a result of it.
It's the key factors I take out of that there, Terry, thank you. They're really good statistics, and I can confirm, as I said before, that on the coalface here in Brisbane, that is what's happening. We are seeing, for the best part, supply outstripped by demand. And while that isn't meaning significant increases in rental prices, it is at least meaning that in most cases we're seeing rents stay stable or the same.
Yeah, I think part of the reason for that is that there's a couple. One is that as a general statement, developers haven't been building as much new product. We did have a period of very high creation of new dwellings around Australia. That's a couple of years ago. The last couple of years, there's been a fall off of construction of new dwellings. That's one factor. Another is that investors have been quite quiet, haven't been as much in the market creating that new rental stock as before. Markets have primarily been driven in terms of sales by owner-occupiers and first-home buyers. So the stock of properties available for rent has diminished in many parts of Australia, including in Brisbane, but in many of our capital cities and many of our regional centres, vacancy rates below 1% have become almost the norm around Australia. So there tend to be upward pressure on rents in most locations in Australia outside of the two biggest cities.
It's interesting there, Tony. Terry, what I've just thought about, and I'd like to touch on while we sort of on the topic, is that we have noticed, which is quite interesting, demand coming from interstate. We've seen people who are coming back into Brisbane from Sydney and Melbourne, not so much Melbourne, but because it's difficult to get out of, but more so New South Wales, Sydney, looking to rent properties up here. Another thing where we've seen demand increase was, as I had predicted early in the piece, we saw in early COVID, mixed generations of people getting together in the same household, and naturally they're getting sick of living within tight constraint with each other and getting on each other's nerves, moving back out and finding their own space. So we've seen demand from, and that's coming from the younger generation, middle generation, older generation. Another thing we've seen of recent times, which I think I've touched on in a slide here somewhere, but I may not have, is that I think I mentioned it just earlier in those earlier slides, was that on the 29th of September at midnight, the Queensland government's temporary reforms in relation to owners being able to evict tenants, what we call sort of, without grounds, expired. So during that period, if a tenant was COVID impacted, and unfortunately, even though the government said that you would need to apply, be assessed formally, meet the requirements to be impacted by COVID, the reality of the matter is, unfortunately, that even if they don't and they've only mentioned COVID and it went to RTA mediation or QCAT tribunal, tenants still couldn't be evicted from a property. So on the 29th of September, that sort of mandate finished, and what we see is, what we're experiencing is that an influx of tenants into the market because they've been kicked out of their other rental properties, and that doesn't help the supply and demand matrix, and also doesn't help because they're an undesirable tenant that has been kicked out of another property. It's unlikely the investors listening today would want to rent to those tenants.
So just a reminder, people watching and listening, if you have a question for Mark or for myself, please type those questions into either the chat box or the Q&A panel, and we'll do our best to answer those questions as we go along. So Mark, I was interested in this information you put on screen now, which we were discussing earlier, that the most commonly searched items for tenants, I assume, are looking for properties to rent.
Yeah, I was, I'm not ashamed to admit it, I was surprised when I read this myself. I, as the Managing Director of licensee, my primary focus on the business is growth. So I deal primarily with new investors looking to come in Bluestone, and I handle the transition and the onboarding and hand it over to a property manager to manage the property. Now, because we're a little bit short-staffed, I'm back on the tools, being a property manager again, and I'm overwhelmed with the amount of inquiry we get for tenants asking about air conditioning and pets. And it was confirmed independently in an article. I don't quote me, but I believe it was realestate.com. and whether these two items in southeast Queensland were the most searched criteria. So, you know, when we're talking about, you know, what sort of things we can do to make your property stand out for tenants, there's two things there. Now, air conditioning, I'll touch on both of these points really quickly, and happy to come back if we get any questions, or always available after this via phone, text or email. Generally with air conditioning, if a property isn't air conditioned or you are adding air conditioning, this is the sort of industry standard that we work on. If we're adding an air conditioning unit to a bedroom split system, the cost is around about $1,500. We generally see an increase in the rent by about $10. On average, that's paid off over 3 years. If it was a larger unit fitted to, let's say 1.5 kilowatt, if we're looking at a 3 to a 5 kilowatt unit installed to a living area that would do sort of lounge, dining, kitchen, and these bigger units filter into bedrooms as well, we would be looking somewhere around $15 a week for the 3 kilowatt, up to $20 a week increase for the 5 kilowatt. And likewise, we'll see that paid off with that extra rent over about 3 years.
So obviously you can charge a higher rent if you are providing air conditioning, but I think it's a different situation with pets, isn't it?
It is. And with pets, you can advertise a higher rent, but you can't say you're asking for a higher rent because you're negotiable to pets. You can't in Queensland legally get any extra bond over and above the 4 weeks rent because a tenant has pets. But look, you can increase the price slightly or charge a little bit more, and then, you know, on your advertising say that you are you know, open to pets, and we would always say negotiable to pets on application, because what we look for is previous rental history in at least one, ideally 2 properties. So when a tenant applies for us with a pet, we go back to the current property manager agency and the previous agency, asking questions like, were they clean and tidy, well maintained, easy to deal with, the typical, did you pay your rent on time, was the bond refunded, and then for the pet, you know, did the pet cause any excessive damage to the property? Because unfortunately, for cats and dogs, is urine in the carpet goes through the carpet into the underlay and to the subfloor, and that ammonia smells, particularly for cats, can be very, very, very hard and expensive to get out. Quite often we see when these situations go wrong, when someone has a cat and doesn't take care of it properly, it can result in damage being excessive of the bond.
Now, I was going to ask the question that how common is it for landlords to be resistant to allowing pets, and is that a reasonable thing for landlords to do? Are pets, you know, a big issue, or is it overblown in the minds of landlords? But you're perhaps suggesting that there are genuine concerns and reasons why a landlord might want to not have pets in the property.
Absolutely. We know that firsthand, because if it's not managed properly, so in a general agency, what we see is if a property manager isn't routinely inspecting the property 2, 3, 4 times a year and checking to see that the tenant and the pet's not causing any damage. So cats, you know, if they don't have, I'm not sure what they call, I'm allergic to cats, so but they have a toy which has carpet on it they can get their claws into and stretch and exercise and so forth. If they don't have those, they do it in the carpet, and they create carpet pulls, which is a loop in the carpet that gets pulled up, and very, very hard to very hard to repair and costly. Now, dogs, other than the urinating in the carpet, dogs can cause things like chewing timbers, like soft edges, being cornice or skirting boards and things like that. And doors, or scratching also cause excessive damage. Now, we are reluctant to rent to tell owners to just openly accept an application for a pet from a tenant that's already in a property when they have no experience or rental reference having lived with that animal and maintained it before, especially a puppy, for instance, or a kitten. You know, people, if they haven't had them before, they're not trained. You don't sort of learn how to do this at school, and it's perfectly reasonable for an owner. How many percent? I'd say probably 25% of our owners are reluctant to accept applications for pets. Now that used to be more, but given how many pets tenants have pets nowadays, I'm finding that more and more owners are compromising because more and more tenants have pets.
Yeah, but it sounds like it would be a reasonable situation for a landlord to actually charge more if they're allowing pets, but and that perhaps needs to be not so much specified in terms of the rental they're asking.
That's right, and there is talk in Queensland. I think it might be like this in New South Wales, or going this way in New South Wales, and also possibly in Victoria, whereas it sounds unbelievable, I know, but it's true, where the government will mandate that an owner of investment property can't discriminate against a tenant because they have a pet. So if the Queensland Labor government gets its way, that's likely to happen in the next couple of years, where you as an investor will not be able to tell a tenant that you cannot have a pet, and nor can you charge any extra bond.
I hope they're very careful to define what pets are. I mean, there's all sorts of animals that people could have as pets. There's some you definitely wouldn't want to have in your property. I hope they're thinking about that particular aspect and shaping their legislation.
But look, that's just one of the or two of the items there, Terry. But a couple of the other, which are the more common below the other items I've listed there, which you can do to make your property stand out. This one shouldn't cost you any extra money. Ensuring that your property manager makes sure that the previous tenant keeps the property really clean and well presented, so that when the new tenants come through. Two things: if the current tenant's still in the property, which is what we do at Bluestone here, is we typically set it up. We have a special condition in our lease. When the current tenant signs the lease, they acknowledge that when they decide to move out, that they will let us show prospective tenants through the property. Now, that helps minimise the vacancy period for the investor. Now, tenants can refuse, even though we have that special condition in there, tenants can refuse entry. Now, also make sure the property is well maintained. Now, that does cost the investor a little bit more money. However, it is worthwhile. It's the small things. It's the loose door handles, the fly screen that has a tear in it because of age, not because of malicious damage by the current tenant, but it's the little things, painting, when the carpet is clearly beyond its lifespan, and the tax depreciation lifespan of a carpet is 8 years. Insurance also reference off that because it's tax legislated law. Insurance companies also say basically if a carpet's in excess of 8 years old, they won't pay out on any claims against it. So typically we see in a property, after 8 to 10, 12 years, if your carpet's looking tired, upgrade it and increase the rent. If the paint's looking tired, it's got scuff marks and holes and little blemishes that are commonly and easily missed in between tenancies, and can be claimed and defended as fair wear and tear. Get a plaster in, patch and plaster and paint. You do the carpet. They're little things that make a big difference to not just the rent that you charge. They make a difference to the vacancy period, the days on market, the quality of tenant that you get in there, and then the time frame, that occupancy I talked about before. You want to try and get a tenant in there that's going to stay for 2, 3, 4 years, 5 years. I've known of having been exposed directly to the industry for 21 years and indirectly for 40 years now, through growing up in a household where both of my parents worked in real estate and owned 3 LJ Hooker real estate agencies, that we had tenants in properties for 30 years. They had effectively paid off the mortgage for the property. And that was because there was a mutual understanding between the owner and the tenant and the agency, where everybody was on a good wicket, everybody was winning.
In terms of keeping a property clean, well maintained, and becoming aware of those little maintenance items that it's good to keep up to date and not let get out of hand, for me, it's very important to have a good property manager on your team, someone who does regular inspections, because there's a big difference between a good one and a bad one. And one of the factors for me, one of the criteria in selecting a property manager is making sure that they're doing very regular inspections and will give me a detailed report with photos so that I know that the property is well maintained and I'm alerted to any issues that need to be attended to.
Yeah, that's right, Terry. So what we find is when a new tenant goes into the property, we will inspect it to the maximum that the legislation in Queensland allows for, which is 4 times, once every quarter. But what we also do is we have an electronic platform. I can use it on my on an Apple or a Samsung phone, an iPad, and it's called Inspection Manager, and it's a digital photo report. We can take up to 400 photos, and as the old saying goes, a picture speaks 1,000 words. So we go through that and we take photos, and we can tag on the actual photo a comment and make additional comments, and we send that through to the owners. Now, there is also a balance there with a really good quality tenant. Let's say we go in 4 times in the first 12 months and the property's really well presented, like a show home. And I've done sales for many years too. And I know for a fact that there is a relatively high percentage of tenants out there that maintain properties in better condition and cleanliness than many owner-occupiers do. Now, what we do with those types of tenants, if they pay their rent on time, they're a pleasure to deal with, and they maintain the property, we then try and scale those inspections back to the following year. We might do 3, and then the year after that, we might go back to biannual inspections. Now, what they talk about with this in the legislation is affording the tenant what the government called quiet enjoyment of the property. Now, to put this into the context of this conversation, it is, as a tenant, Terry, if you will keep living in a property that you rented from us and maintaining it neat as a pin, paying your rent on time, after the 3rd, 4th, 5th year, if we're still going 4 times a year, you probably feel like you've been a little bit imposed on and that the owner and the agency aren't trusting you. So there's nothing wrong with trying to manage those expectations for all parties and getting agreements. We wouldn't do it without getting our owners to agree to it and saying to them, look, if it's okay with you, we'll scale it back. This way, the tenant's not feeling like they're being watched and being questioned and reported on, and we get a win-win, and that typically can result in tenants staying around for longer. And the benefit the owner gets is if they are maintaining the property like a show home and paying their rent on time, and there's no excessive fair wear and tear, they're getting the benefit of a higher occupancy, a higher rental yield.
Okay. So you've got some basic question there on screen in terms of how long it will take to rent your property, how you present it, etc. Perhaps you could talk us through some of those items.
Yeah, so I'll just flick through a couple of the slides here, and just feel free to pull me up at any stage, Terry, if you've got any questions. And this one here, I've got there. I'll sort of touch on it. Supply and demand, which we talked about. You need to advertise the property. Now in Queensland or Southeast Queensland, the predominant platform is realestate.com. I do know that in interstate, in certain areas of Sydney and Melbourne, Domain is more dominant. You can't rent a secret, so you need to get the property out there in front of people, and without a doubt, the main source of that is online. The rent that you're advertising is also important. Now, I'll come back to that because we have talked about it before, but I've got a case study in the slides down the track that I can show you right here. So to give you an example to show this is how I typically find. Some people get it very, very quickly. Other people need to see it like this. So this case study looks at the shorter vacancy period, more income. So it's a lower rent, higher occupancy strategy as opposed to a longer vacancy period with less income due to higher rent. Now, as you can see in first column, I've just got you there. That's $2,000 in their pocket. As opposed to $490 a week and vacant for 4 weeks, they're getting $23,520. And if you reduce the rent to $480 and rented it immediately, so for 52 weeks, you're getting $24,960. So there's $1,500, $3,000 difference there in the yield that's created between those. Now that's an extreme example, I realise that, but it does help put it into perspective, and this case study does help people realise how much difference the asking rent can make. And it's surprising, and people often come back and say, okay, well, all right, I realise that if I do drop the rent a little bit and get someone in sooner, it's going to mean more money in my back pocket. Additionally, it's just more peace of mind. Now, we've just got to try and balance those expectations out. We're often dealing with 2 or 3 different owners of a property, primarily 2 owners, and it's not uncommon for those 2 owners to have a different perspective on how this should work. So, what we can do, as I talked about before, is start at the higher amount whilst the property is tenanted and reduce it as we come closer to when the tenant moves out and vacancy period. The other option there is if the property is vacant and you're starting from scratch, if the rent's too high, don't take too long. You need to trust me on this. Don't take 4 weeks to reduce the rent. If after 1 week you aren't getting inquiries, inspections and applications, make an adjustment to the rent while you've still got people active and interested in the property. Look, in any market, ultimately the price depends on these factors, your motivation. So, we will see there will always be somebody out there well-heeled. They might have inherited the property that's on the market around the corner. They don't have a mortgage on it, and they will sit there and persist at the higher amount. Use that to your advantage. Make your property $5, $10, $15 a week more attractive to tenants because they're shopping. It's their hard-earned cash that they need to part with to rent your property. As I said, the marketing. Now, the other thing is the quality of the photos. A lot of people now, we advocate this here at Bluestone, using professional photos for rental properties. Now, it used to only be for sale properties, but nowadays, tenants are shopping with their eyes. Realestate.com have removed the heading from most advertisements, so all the tenant sees the photo. It's really important that the quality of that photo is good. And the photo that's selected, how many times I see online when I'm doing comparables and there's some shitty, excuse my French, sorry, some ordinary photo of a bathroom or a walk-in wardrobe or a bedroom that's dark and dingy, as we talked about it before, and ultimately supply and demand, which dictates.
So, Mark, to what level should a landlord go to make sure they have good quality photos? Should they employ a professional to come and take photos, or?
Absolutely. Now, we get our photos. I've been dealing with this photographer for about 10 years. I do realise it's a pretty good deal. You might not be able to get this elsewhere, but Bluestone investors pay $121 for a minimum of 8 photos, which is typically enough for a rental property. And it's like chalk and cheese. We've had properties, we manage a lot of properties that have been sold off the plan. So we might manage half a dozen houses in the one street. And we'll have 2 identical properties on the market at the same time. They're literally identical. They're 2 or 3 houses apart, built by the same builder, exactly the same design, the same colour scheme, the same size block of land. It's the old cookie cutter theory. And one will have professional photos and one won't. And it rents this is the number of levels. It rents quicker, for more money, and to a better quality tenant.
Okay.
On average, say $450 a week, you get a return on that $121 investment by renting the property out 3 days sooner.
Yeah, I mean, it can be a classic case of false economy not to spend a relatively small amount of money, because having made that very small investment, you're going to get a much better return a higher rental, and that higher rental that you might achieve as a result of that small outlay is going to be there for 52 weeks of the year.
That's right, and you can use photos legally in Queensland as long as they're representative of the property up to about 5 years, maybe stretch it out to 7 if it's really, really well maintained and clean and tidy, but you can at least use it for 3 to 4, up to 5 years. So I think I worked it out, it's like $1 a week, on average for someone. So, as I said, I've pretty much covered everything on this slide. There's an example for you, and this is one of our, this might even be that property actually. The top photo is taken on a iPhone or an Android. It's sort of dark. It's not very wide angle. It doesn't show the whole bathroom. The photo at the bottom is taken professional photo, light, bright, airy, wider angle. It just looks so much more appealing. Now, if this wouldn't be the lead photo, but let's say, for example, it was, which one are you going to click on and apply for? I know which one I'd be clicking on. Yeah. So these are statistics that come independently. It's a good investment. As I said there, you can use them for a number of years. Here's some just other facts around it. 95% of tenants shortlisting properties by the photos. You get more inquiries, more applications. Now, it could make the smallest difference is getting 2 applications for your property. One is a tenant that's, offering a lower rent, has a poor rental history, maybe only looking for a 6-month lease, as opposed to a quality tenant that has a really good rental history and is maybe due to the competition might even offer you a little bit more rent. We rented a property recently. This guy was in between jobs and had very little time to move. It was the property we had sort of 45 people, 15 groups of people lined up out the door, and he offered to pay an extra $10 a week rent. As you can see there, $4.30 a week. It only takes 3 days sooner to rent the property. It's a small investment, and it is an investment. I always use that term investment. People have invested in an asset that's worth $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. So why wouldn't you invest $120 into photos? It's a very small investment. I've got the statistics down the bottom there.
Yeah. Okay. Makes a lot of sense.
I have to move your screen. 38 cents a week. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I've got a couple of other key facts there. Terry, I'm not sure how to access the questions that people are asking down the bottom there, sorry, but you might be able to do that. I did see a question come through. But while you're having a look at that, I think you touched on some of these before. So we see the median asking rents, apartments, Brisbane, 400, houses, 450. Interesting, houses has gone up $10 a week since the last quarter. Vacancy rate, 2%. To give an example, 1.1 in Castledine as opposed to Brisbane. And the median days of market, 27 days for apartments, 15 days for houses. That confirms what I said before about what we're seeing is 2 markets in Brisbane.
I think the comparable numbers in different parts of the country, because those, a lot of it's relative to vacancy rates and how much demand there is in the market relative to what's available. And we are seeing, you've got on the screen Castledine 1.1% as a suburb there. But we're seeing vacancy rates like that right across the country, just with the exceptions being the big city, inner city areas, the CBD areas and near suburbs, much higher. But quite commonly throughout our smaller capital cities and many of our regional markets, 1.5%, 1%, lower than 1% is common. Therefore, properties that become available for rental aren't staying on the market very long.
No, and unfortunately, we're not seeing, usually, as you know, when these vacancy rates are so low, you normally see significant increases in prices, but unfortunately, that's not happening. However, I do believe it will. I think Brisbane, I'm very, very confident with all of my experience and being here on the ground, with my finger on the pulse, that Brisbane will bounce back quicker than the other markets and it will bounce back stronger.
And in some cities of Australia, for those in other parts of Australia who are watching and listening, we are seeing significant rental increases. Perth is probably the best example. A market that previously, a few years ago, had quite high vacancies. They've come down very rapidly, and they're now getting quite strong rental increases in a very tight market. So we're starting to see that happen in markets around Australia, and I think we will see more of that. And it's an interesting point for investors to keep in mind, because what we know to be true from our experience and our research is that when vacancies are tight and rentals start to rise, prices do tend to follow as well. So I think we're going to see significant price uplift in some of these markets, and we're already seeing it, in fact, in many markets around Australia already. I think we're heading into a very, very strong situation nationwide with property markets.
Yeah, no, good statistics and good commentary there, Terry. We have a property around the corner, almost identical to that one we've just rented. We've advertised it for a month. Now, it could be because we started a month out and tenants just aren't looking up until, most tenants look in about a 2-week window before they need the property. And it's on it. That other one was on at 375, and the tenant offered 385, and we've got an almost identical property on the market around in the same suburb, a couple of roads away, for 390, and it's been on the market for 3 weeks and we haven't rented it. So the last point there is investors must list at market value. Now, this is an excerpt from a court case way back in the 1907, and I've sort of adapted it from being a sales to a rental. In the highest price, a ready, willing and able tenant will pay when not forced to rent from a ready, willing and able investor not forced to rent for a property that's been adequately exposed to the marketplace.
That's a precedent that's been around for over a century.
Yes, and one I still like to use today, because at the end of the day, people ask us, "Oh, what do you think the property's worth, Mark?" And I say to them, "Well, look, it really doesn't matter what I think, because I'm not going to be renting the property from you." And they said, "Well, can you tell us what you think it's worth?" And I said, "Well, look, I won't even tell you what I think it's worth. I will tell you what I think the market value is, and I'll substantiate that with at least 3 comparables within the last 3 months." And then that's ultimately the market. The tenants dictate the price, not me.
Just a point that we touched on before we went to air. Is it a good idea, your property's coming up for rental, to actually show a property while the tenant's still in there? You might have an open house, for example. Is it best to wait till the property's vacant before you do that?
Depends on the tenant, the willingness of the current tenant to allow you access. Now, if that tenant is clean, tidy, the property's well maintained, and they're naturally packing up, and you explain to the tenants coming through the property. So we train our property managers, our leasing consultants, went at the front door and, "Hi Terry, can you register the inspection?" No problems. Just be mindful of the current tenants moving out. There are some boxes. The cleaning is probably not quite up to standard, but it will be professionally cleaned and the carpet's cleaned before you move into the property.
Okay.
Now, it can minimise the days on market. The vacancy period is the primary purpose to do that. Some other benefits that we do find are that the prospective tenants get to see a property with furniture in it rather than being empty. Now, I quite often find people coming back to me, we might show them, because we're managing a lot of these properties that have been sold off the plan, and they're like townhouses that are identical in the same complex, or that house I talked about before. We'll show one and then show the second property that still has a tenant in it, and the prospective tenant will come out the door and say, "Oh, that's really interesting. I can see where the couch and the TV and where the dining table is going to go." So there are some additional benefits like that you don't think about. But however, even we've had cases where we have processed an application for a tenant, put them in, the references said they're clean, tidy, and they've lived in a property and had a relationship breakdown, and one partner's left and the one that has remained has sort of, the wheels have fallen off a little bit, and the cleaning and the tidiness has gone by the wayside. We make an executive decision when we go to that property whether or not we will show it. There are cases where we'll come back to you and say, "Look, Terry, You know, as you're aware, there's been a separation, and the remaining tenant is not handling the situation very well. They haven't sort of cleaned and maintained the cleaning to the standard that we think is beneficial to show the property, and there's quite a bit of clutter, and it's just not in the best interest. We think it would be detrimental to your cause to show the property early.
Okay, mate, we might just, we're coming up to the hour in about 5 minutes, so perhaps look at some of the questions that are there. Laura's actually making a comment, but it begs the question, saying as a tenant and landlord, I can't believe that landlords don't provide air conditioning or accept pets. In terms of air conditioning, how common is it for properties? You know, Australia's got a pretty hot climate, and some places get cold in the winter as well. How common to have properties available for rent that don't have some sort of air conditioning?
Yeah, look, I've as I said before, I've been around a long time. 20, 30, 40 years ago, extremely uncommon, even in southeast Queensland. Like, you know, I grew up here. Our schools didn't have air conditioning. I now live in our house that has air conditioning, but I very rarely use it. I guess I'm acclimatised to the heat and humidity of southeast Queensland. It doesn't really worry me personally. But I would probably estimate that around about 75% of properties nowadays, probably 80, could go as far as 85% of properties are air conditioned. But yeah, there still are some of the older properties, or even those ones that are air conditioned. Like, that's a fairly high percentage. Let's say average it at 80%. 85% of properties air conditioned. Now, a lot of those are living area master bedroom only. It's not as common to find a property with air conditioning to all bedrooms. I just found out a slightly more affordable way to investors to do it, and it does end up costing the tenant a little bit more. We just had an air conditioning split system installed. A quote was done by one company for a reputable, well-known brand of air conditioner that most people would become familiar with. Around about $1,500 to $1,700. We got a brand I hadn't heard before, but it's a second-tier brand from a major provider, and $1,100. I asked the electrician what the difference was. He said that they are a cheaper unit made by a reputable company, a secondary brand, but the biggest difference is the running costs. So they're like a 3-star as opposed to a 5-star. And that ends up meaning that there's a bit of a compromise made there, because you can get it for $1,100 instead of, let's say, $1,600. It's going to cost the tenant a little bit more money to run that.
Okay. There's a quick question there from Maro. Can we discuss a little bit about the Melbourne market with sales and rents? How do we see it going? Perhaps I could field that one, Mark. Look,
I'll help you there, sorry, Maro, but
it's very much location specific. We've got some general data here for Melbourne overall. There's actually been very, very little contraction of rentals in Melbourne. You would expect that because it's the city that's had a second wave and a second lockdown, that it might be more detrimentally affected. But in actual fact, that the market, both price-wise and rental-wise, and in terms of vacancies, has held up pretty well. But it's a case-by-case scenario. It's different from location to location. Melbourne's a big city. We've recently been updating a number of our reports for specific areas of Melbourne, and it's been a pleasant surprise to see how vacancies have not blown out in most areas. Obviously, the CBD is an exception. Rents and prices have remained quite solid. In some places, prices have continued to rise. It's really a supply and demand situation. There's been not as many buyers in the Melbourne market because it's very difficult to buy in the recent restrictions, but there have been even fewer people actually listing their properties for sale. So there's relative to supply, demand's been pretty well balanced, and so prices have stayed solid. The areas we notice where vacancies have gone a little bit higher are those areas that are perhaps dependent on university students, and obviously universities haven't been functioning as normal. But now we're starting to see the restrictions starting to ease, and that will accelerate, I think, in the coming weeks, So we'll start to see things get back to normal. I think Melbourne's going to come back very strongly. I think the early indications are that Melbourne's market is going to come surging out of lockdown and be actually quite a strong market. So I think it's going to do pretty well. And again, prove the resilience of real estate in good locations as just how well it's held up in the circumstances.
Terry, with the rental market in Melbourne, is it strong too? Is it primary? One of the reasons because people just can't move around. Like you can't just give notice to leave this property and move to the other side of Melbourne.
That will be a factor right now, but generally speaking, just looking at all the data from Melbourne, it really has stayed pretty solid overall. There may be some longer term factors like overseas migration has been a major factor for Melbourne, and that's been turned off for now. There's also the factor of a certain number of people moving out of Melbourne to the country as the exodus to affordable lifestyle, I call it. That's a very strong trend. So we'll get to see just what that will do to some sections of the Melbourne market at least. We just come up to the hour mark. Your final slide, I think, refers to some sort of offer you're making to our customers who are watching and listening today.
Yeah, so anyone this is just a bit of a rejig on the previous webinars we've done where we've offered a health check. We sort of do a 4 or 5 point health check of your current management agreement, whether you have insurance, the lease, just a few things to make sure, like going to your doctor, diagnose before prescribe. We have an ultimate guide to property management available, which is about a 30 chapter. They're not large chapters. It's about 7,000 words, 30 sort of main paragraphs is really the chapter is a paragraph. They're sort of breaking up property management into a step-by-step guide, probably more beneficial for new investors. And then our cheat sheet, learn the questions to ask your property manager. Talks about, funny enough, a lot of the things we've talked about today. So make those available to everyone. But this is something which we haven't done before for listeners. And then we manage properties in the greater Brisbane area, Coomera, Ormo, Yarrabilba, sort of Springfield. That's the south, Springfield to Ipswich in the west, the Bayside in the east, and sort of Caboolture in the north. We are offering 50% off your first 3 years management fees for 3 or more properties, 37.5% of 2 years for 2 properties, and 25% off your first year management for, that should be 1 property, my mistake. The T's and C's apply there. They're just pretty basic terms and condition. We just need to retain management of those 1, 2 or 3 properties. My contact details are down the bottom there, Terry. Call, text or emails. And there they are there, a little bit easier for people to read. Please reach out to me. I'm more than happy to help any investors locally or interstate, answer any questions that they have, talk about in more detail the topics that we've talked about today, and provide some, worst case, independent second opinion.
Okay. All right, thanks for that, Mark. And our timing is great. We've just clicked over the hour, so a good point to wrap up. Thank you, Mark Shorrock from Bluestone, for your presentation today. Lots of excellent information there. There's a couple of things that stand out for me as points that were particularly useful from my own personal viewpoint. One was the illustration that you made, particularly with that slide showing that often a lower rent can lead to a high yield, and it sounds counterintuitive, doesn't it? But the fact that if you're actually, rather than holding out for a higher rent, you're actually accepting a slightly lower rent and actually having a higher occupancy for more weeks of the year, you're going to end up with more rental income throughout the year and a higher yield overall. I think so. That was a point well made. The point you made about the amount of wear and tear involved in one tenant moving out and another tenant moving in. So therefore the importance of keeping a good tenant in place for as long as you can, and that may depend on the keeping the rental at the current level, making sure the property is well maintained, so the current tenant is more likely to want to stay. And I also thought it was a great point that spending as little as $120 on quality photos to present your property well online can result in a shorter vacancy period, a higher rental, better quality tenant. I thought those are all wonderful points that I think people watching and listening will be able to make use of. So
all knit together to keep a tenant there for 3 years, good quality tenant at a reasonable rent, puts more money in your pocket, pay more money off your mortgage, create more equity. Everybody wins.
Okay. So thank you, Mark Shorrock. Great presentation. I think lots of value there for people who are watching and listening, and everybody who has registered for today's event, and including those that tuned in live and those who weren't able to. We will send a copy of the presentation out to everyone who registered, so you'll be able to have a copy of the slides. You can also contact Mark directly if you'd like a copy of the slides, but we will be sending it out to everybody who registered for the webinar today. So, good time to wrap up. Thanks, Mark. Terry Ryder from hotspotting.com.au signing off. Thanks for your attendance, and let's do it again soon.
Thank you, Terry. Always a pleasure.
Okay. Thank you, Mark.